An election broadcast on behalf of the Labour Party.
This election is hotting up. The Tories are really badly shaken by the evidence of a Labour swing everywhere, and it's no wonder that they're lashing out. Tonight, we are going to examine their credentials, their record, their promises, and their performance. First, let's look at what they're saying. Life's better under the Conservatives. You've never had it so good. Everything's all right. There's nothing to worry about at all. Super Mac is watching over all of us. But is this really true?
Under the Conservative government, Britain's industrial production sadly lags behind the rest of Europe. And as regards volume of exports, the rest of the world has passed us by. But in one respect, Great Britain leads everybody. The cost of living has skyrocketed.
Let's look at this Tory record in greater detail. Up in Manchester, Christopher Mayhew is waiting with some more figures.
Well, frankly, the end bit of that cartoon wasn't absolutely fair. The cost of living has steadied down recently, thanks largely to the creation of unemployment. But if we take the whole record of Britain under the Tory government, the cartoon's quite right, it's disgraceful. A rise of 36% in the cost of living up to April this year. Worse than almost any comparable country. Higher than Austria, Italy, the Netherlands, the United States and Western Germany. If you take the 12 main comparable countries, Britain's record is the worst of all except one. And the cartoon was also right, of course, in pointing out that while the Tories have succeeded, or rather they've failed in stopping a rise in the cost of living, they've succeeded in stopping a big rise in production. Over all these years, a mere 21%. Worse than the United States, who've done badly enough, much worse than the Netherlands, Austria, Italy, Western Germany. Again, if you take the 12 comparable countries, Britain's record is worst of all except one. And our rate of increase in production is only half that achieved under the Labour government. And it's on this miserable 21% increase in production that on Tuesday night we saw and heard Mr. MacLeod and Mr. Errol at interminable length congratulating themselves.
There then is the record. Low production, high prices, deliberate unemployment. Is Britain, as the Tories say, really booming? Harold Wilson is in the operations room tonight with Woodrow Wyatt.
The Tories have shouted, "You've never had it so good at us," so much that you'd think we were practically in heaven. What do you think about that?
Well, is there anybody outside the Primrose League who's really fooled by all this? Of course things are a lot better 14 years after the war than they were in those very difficult years when we were trying to recover from the most devastating war in history. Of course there are more cars and more television sets. The same is true in every other country. It isn't the government that's produced them. We'd have had the same number of cars and television sets if we'd had a government of chimpanzees.
So we could have had it much better.
Yes, many other countries have had it much better. As we've just seen, production has increased in most other countries. Just think how much better it would have been today in this country if we'd had a Labour government dedicated to increase production every year instead of a Tory government with production increasing only every election year.
Now, Lord Hailsham says that if we carry out our programme with the increased production that's necessary for it, that it's going to cost us £1,000 million a year, and we can't afford it without crippling increases in taxation.
Well, we all know Lord Hailsham. But of course that figure is greatly exaggerated. Though, of course, even if it were true, the Tories have increased government expenditure by much more than that, and scarcely anyone has benefited from it. But, of course, in our case, we are going to carry out our programme without such an increase in cost. And I'll tell you how we're going to pay for it. not by increasing taxation, but by increasing production. Suppose production in this country only increased, for example, by as much as in the rest of Western Europe. That's not much to ask, though it seems to be too much for the Tories. If we achieved only that, we would have, by 1964, about £3,500 million more of increased wealth in this country. And the Chancellor of the Exchequer would have £1,000 million more of increased revenue without raising any rates of tax at all.
Well, does it have to increase at that rate anyway if Mr. Butler's promised that we're going to double our standard of living in 25 years?
Well, only last night the Chancellor of the Exchequer was doubting the nation's ability to increase production at that rate. I think that's a pretty serious slur on the British people. But of course, if he does doubt our ability, then he's throwing over Mr. Butler's promise to double the standard of living in 25 years completely.
So we can do it and have tax reliefs as well?
Yes, certainly, over the 5 years. Of course, we've made clear over a year or two now, in fact, ever since Mr. Butler's post-election autumn budget of 1955, that we're going to get rid of some of the taxes on essentials that he introduced. Clothing, furniture, textiles, there's nothing new in that.
Well, you said it to me, as a matter of fact, in a radio interview.
Last week, yes.
But now, a lot of people are saying, oh, it doesn't make any difference which side you vote for, they're all the same. Well, what difference would there be in a Labour budget?
Well, could you see a Labour Chancellor of the Exchequer with £300 million to give away, leaving the old age pensioners out in the cold, as was done last April, for example?
Well, just tell me the main points that would characterise a Labour budget.
Well, first and foremost, we've got to use the budget to help strengthen industry, to expand production, to expand exports, to make the pound strong in the markets of the world. Secondly, we've got to use the budget to relieve hardship and poverty in this country. And thirdly, I think we've got to use it to remove a great deal of the inequality in our tax system. Now, take, for example, most people in this country, under the PAYE system, wage earners, salary earners, are paying the full amount of tax that they're supposed to be paying. But a number of people are dodging the amount of tax that they ought to be paying. For example, in the capital gains field, we hear of vast fortunes being made, especially in the property market. Now, it seems to me quite wrong that they shouldn't be paying taxes when the others have got to pay such heavy rates of taxes.
Well, will you, as a Chancellor of the Exchequer, stand up to any sectional interests that try and take you for a ride in stormy weather?
Well, in stormy weather or in any other kind of weather, the national interest has got to come first. And whatever pressures we may have, whether it's from anti-British speculators in the city, or from the Institute of Directors, or from a trade union for that matter, the national interest has got to put first, and this we shall do.
Next, pensions. As it turns out, one of the biggest arguments of this campaign. The Tories, of course, have tried to muddle people about the difference between the two schemes.
No. Will somebody please explain this pension scheme to me?
Well, it's very simple, really, if you look at the basic principle. Compare the scheme to a bathing hut. Say your clothes represent the weekly payments.
My clothes?
Well, this is what you might put in per week.
Right. Now what?
The Tory government keeps 3 out of 4 of your garments as a kind of tax.
What? Well, what do I get when I retire?
You get back about a quarter of what you put in. Say, one of your articles back.
What about the Labour scheme?
Well, let's start again. Same principle,
All right.
except you give slightly more per week.
And what do I get when I retire?
Well, first you get all your investments back, and you would have enough extra per week for added protection.
Ah, so the idea is, with the Labour scheme, I put in a little more, but I get a great deal more in return. Very simply explained. Thank you.
We've talked a lot tonight about the massive Tory failure in industry. But what about the countryside? How have they been getting on there? Albert Hilton is a Norfolk man, and after 8 years of Tory government, this is what he has to say.
Agriculture, as well as industry in general, has suffered in recent years from Tory stagnation. There's been no real increase in production. The big farmers are doing all right, but most of our farmers are small ones. They certainly are not prosperous. They can't afford to gamble on the Tories' marketing systems. They've suffered from cuts in prices of milk, eggs and bacon, but the price to the consumer has not been cut. A Labour government will restore confidence and stability. For farm workers and other rural workers, we want to bring their conditions up to those enjoyed by workers in the towns and cities. We will enable the Wages Board to introduce a sick pay scheme, and our national superannuation scheme will be of great benefit both to farm and other rural workers. A Labour government would ensure full employment because we believe in it. This I give as a pledge. We must have more houses to let in the countryside. Our children must have as good an education as their town cousins. Many of our village schools must be reorganised, especially the all-age schools. Rural transport must be improved. Where we have to rely on buses, there must be better services. Old people in the countryside are often far worse off than those in towns. Often the same voluntary services are not available to assist old folk. It is not so easy for them to get around.
Well, those are some of the reasons why there's been such a terrific swing to the Labour Party in the countryside as well as in the towns in the last week or so. All kinds of people have offered their support and help. People like Humphrey Lyttelton, who in this election is blowing our trumpet.
I first began supporting the Labour Party when it took its stand over Suez. Since then, it has consistently spoken up for people like me who regard such affairs as Cyprus, Hola Camp, Nyasaland as matters of national shame and disgrace. And that's reason enough for me to give it my full support.
Jill Balkan, the actress, had this to say.
As the mother of 2 young children, I think that the most important issue at the moment for all of us is the bomb. And I'm hoping that the Labour Party will make a most tremendous drive to achieve nuclear disarmament.
Professor Eyre of Oxford and the Brains Trust had this to say.
Everyone ought to have the chance, which not all are getting now, of developing their talents to the best advantage. As things are, the children of poorer parents, and especially those who fail the 11+ examination, are not getting enough done for them. This is the strong point in favour of the Labour idea of comprehensive schools.
Next, I went to see Richie Calder.
I am voting Labour because I want to see a government in power which is aware of the realities of a changing world. We want to see science applied to the benefits of all mankind and to the reduction of poverty and misery throughout the whole world.
Sir Compton Mackenzie invited me to see him in his house in Edinburgh.
Throughout my life, the Tories have never learnt anything from experience. They've never been able to grasp cause and effect. And now, as I approach advanced old age, I feel in my mind and cannot be at the mercy of these boneheads.
He's quite right, you know. The Tories never do learn from experience, particularly not in colonial affairs. As John Osborne said on Monday, places have become the names of crimes: Suez, Cyprus, Nyasaland and Hola. Here now, from Cardiff, is James Callaghan.
One of the tragedies of the last few years is that Africans have been losing confidence in Britain. And one of the reasons why they've done so is because of what's happened at the Hola prison camp. Let me tell you about it. One day last March, the British government in this colony, because it is a British colony, issued a statement telling us that 11 prisoners who were Mau Mau suspects had died suddenly after drinking from a water cart. The implication was that the water was tainted, and it wasn't until the inquest was held that the real truth came out. These men had been clubbed to death by their warders in the full sight of the officer in charge of the prison. Lacerated brains, fractured skulls, broken forearms, broken legs, bruised lungs. 11 of them died, clubbed to death in cold blood. Why? Because they staged a sit-down strike and refused to dig an irrigation canal. They had an inquiry afterwards. It showed that these African prisoners had made no attempt to rebel. There had been no attempt at a breakout, but they were clubbed to death. Now, this, you know, is causing tremendous repercussions in Africa. They say, What's happened to British justice? Is it reserved for white men only? Mr. Lennox Boyd told the House, he's the Colonial Secretary, told the House that Hola was a tragedy. It was more, and the Africans know it. It was a crime. Some of us were very incensed because we've constantly told Mr. Lennox Boyd that conditions in these camps are not right. We've asked him to have an official inquiry. Always he refused. Well, he's still in office. It's his administration which is responsible for what has taken place. He's still there. If Mr. Attlee had been Prime Minister, he would have quickly told Mr. Lennox Boyd what he ought to do. But we've got Mr. Macmillan there now, and his standards are different.
This one incident has shaken the confidence of thousands of Conservatives in the integrity of their own government. Now we go north, we go to Manchester, we join Hugh Gaitskell.
Last Monday I was in Newcastle, and I talked to you from there about the problem of jobs and how people were worrying about it up there. Well, since then, I've been in Scotland and through Scotland and down through Carlisle to Lancashire, and it's pretty much the same story. In Scotland, there's twice as much unemployment as there is in the country generally. And naturally, people are concerned because, in particular, it doesn't seem to be going down. And I think the answer is just the same. It is that we must, first of all, get full employment generally, and then it'll be possible to steer new enterprises and firms into the areas where pockets of unemployment remain. And at the same time, we've got to induce firms to go into these areas by building for them, by offering them loans and grants, and encouraging the local authorities to develop the services that are necessary. Well, the election is hotting up. And personally, I'm quite glad that it is. I think it ought to be lively. I think it's a thing that people ought to care about, and I hope that it will be a very high poll on October the 8th. The fur is flying, and some personal attacks are being made, some upon me. Well, I don't complain about that. It's all part of the show. But I don't, as a matter of fact, intend to reply to them, because I think that most people nowadays are more interested in solid argument about policies and facts than they are in personalities. But there's one thing I'd like to do, and that is to say something about my 1951 budget. You'll have heard a good deal about it from the Tories lately, and they say that I put up taxation. It's quite true, I did. But I'd like you to know why. It was a very difficult year during the Korean War, during which we decided, too, that it was so dangerous that we had to rearm, we had to step up our defense expenditure quickly and by a substantial amount. And I had to find about 400 million or more in 1 year. Well, of course, I had to put up taxation. It was unpopular, it wasn't easy, it wasn't nice, but we had to do it. It was our duty, and personally, I think we were right. I've been thinking lately about the election and the central issue of it, and how one could put it best, away from the hustings. And I think I'd like to say this. We really all agree, or we claim at any rate, that we can double our standard of living in 25 years, that we can increase output and we can all be better off. The question really is what we're going to do with the extra that comes along. And we in the Labour Party say that the first call on this must be to help those suffering from hardship and distress now. That's what we stand for. The other day, in one of these programs, a friend of ours described the Labour Party as being the party of conscience and reform. I like that. That's what it is.
2 practical points. We still need more workers in our committee rooms. If you haven't already volunteered, please come along. And secondly, we desperately need more cars on polling day. The Tories, as you know, took advantage of their majority to change the law, hoping it would give them an advantage with the old and the sick who couldn't get to the polls by themselves. So we need more helpers now and cars on polling day. And finally, as always, a question on your behalf to the Tories.
Will the Conservatives give a pledge before polling day that if elected, there will be no further increase in rents?
That was an election broadcast on behalf of the Labour Party.